I'm aware that sometimes people think, that the church doesn't care. Fred Craddock, who was professor of preaching in New Testament at the Candler School of Theology, recalls dealing with this sentiment in his own church. He said this: I was walking out one Sunday to go to the parking lot and passed the choir room. I passed this woman who was in the process of hanging up her choir robe. I said casually, I really enjoyed the anthem this morning. Well, she said, I hope so, because that is it for me. What do you mean? I asked. She said, I'm hanging it up. She was hanging up her robe as she said that. I'm hanging it up. What does that mean? I said. What is the matter? Well, she answered, this is my last Sunday. I thought she was retiring from the choir. She'd been at it for about 30 years. Nope, she said, I'm not retiring, I'm quitting. She said, I finally accepted the question that has been haunting me for years now. I looked out at all of the people, the ushers, the pastor, and it just finally sunk into me. Who cares? Who cares whether or not I am in the choir? Who cares whether or not I am even here? Who cares? Craddock said, I left the church that afternoon and tried to dismiss it. Oh, go home and get you something to eat and you'll feel better, I said. But what she said to me kept haunting me. Who cares? So I picked up the phone and I called her. And I asked her if I could come over and talk. Well, if you wanna, she said. Well, I wanna, I said. I went over to her house and told her, you're wrong. She said, I'm not wrong. I gave her a little church history. I said, what you said of your church this morning is called one of the 7 deadly sins, acedia. It is translated in the King James Version as sloth, but that doesn't capture its real meaning. Acedia means simply not caring. It is possible for a person to walk by the old man feeding the birds in the park and say, well, he's not my father. It is possible to see a hungry child and say, well, he's not my kid. It is possible to look at the widow staring out in a bleak world and say, well, she's not my mother. The greatest insult that we can say to the world is, I don't care. I said, lady, do you realize what you have done? You have charged me and everyone in that church with one of the 7 deadly sins. She said, so? I told her it was not the first time I had heard that criticism. I had heard her same argument from others. I think I heard it most forcefully from a particular man some years ago. His wife came to church with the children, but he never came. When I would go over to the house and visit the family, this old man would come out and act like a Philistine. Always his arguments were the same. Church doesn't care anything about me. Another name, another pledge. Need some more money over at that church, preacher? Is that why you're here? I heard him say it 100 times, while tears welled up in his eyes. There was a day when he finally stopped saying it. He was in Veterans Hospital. He had cancer. He was down to 70 pounds. Too late, they said. Shouldn't have been smoking, they said. I want you to know that in every window in that room there were flowers. By his bed, a stack of cards 20 inches thick. Even that thing that they swing around the bed to put food in had flowers on it. I want to tell you that every one of them, are you listening now? Every one of them came from groups or individuals in that church. He couldn't speak, so he wrote something on the Kleenex box. And you know what he wrote? You know what he wrote? Tell the people I was wrong. They care. Fred went on, I got up to leave this lady's house and I said, so you see, you are wrong. There are people who care. I've never been in a church yet, big or small, when there was a situation of need, a house in distress, or pain, or bereavement, but that there were the footprints of Christians that were left behind. They came with pies, with a gift, with a kind word, something, but always they came. I said, people everywhere care. And you know what she said? She said, oh yeah? Name some. Her heart was still aching. The challenge that Fred Craddock ended his story with was with this. She wants names. May I give her yours? You see, when I was thinking about our sermon for today, I couldn't help but think of verse 3 in the letter to Corinthians today. We put no obstacle in anyone's way, so that no fault may be found in our ministry. Do you understand what I mean? We can keep people from wanting to be Christians if we don't remember that wherever we go and whatever we do, we are watched by others to see if we really believe in our God and if we really love others as God teaches us to love. As in verse 4, we are called to be servants of God, to be wide open roads that lead people to Jesus and to a better understanding of God, no matter what our situation. Paul names some of those situations in verses 4 and 5. And you heard them. Great endurance and afflictions, hardships, calamities, beatings, imprisonments, riots, labors, sleepless nights, hunger, by purity, knowledge, and patience and kindness. We can surpass them. We are to open our hearts for Jesus no matter whether life is good or bad, no matter whether we receive honor or disrespect, no matter what our circumstances may be. As we've talked a lot about this morning, our circumstances may change during the course of our lives. It wouldn't be human life if that weren't the case. And yet our relationship with God remains constant, and our call to be faithful to God remains constant. Imagine just for a minute walking 250,000 miles, or maybe better, letting the horse walk 250,000 miles, around Britain. That's something that's likely to deter even the most enthusiastic traveler. Add to that the task of preaching 40,000 sermons, mostly out in the open air, often confronting angry protesters as you go. Not a job for the faint-hearted, but that's exactly what John Wesley did. And his work and that of his brother Charles led directly to the foundation of the Methodist Church. John Wesley was born 315 years ago last Sunday, June 17th, to the Reverend Samuel and Susanna Wesley in Epworth, England. Surely John Wesley stands as one of the giants in human history, even though he was not very tall. Think about it. Today, there are an estimated 10 million United Methodists in the United States and an estimated total of 51 million Methodists worldwide. All this from this one man's efforts to follow God. You heard this morning the report from our annual conference. Some of the news was good and exciting. We can celebrate the hope and the joy of the people called Methodist. Some of the news may have been confusing or discouraging, and we can pray for that. Jesus does not promise to calm every storm in our lives, but Jesus does promise to calm us in the midst of every storm in our lives. John Wesley knew this. He could hardly have been called a faint-hearted stay-at-home, but there were times when, due to the circumstances of his life, even he lost his nerve. During one of Wesley's several Atlantic crossings, a frighteningly fierce storm broke out, pitching and tossing the ship about like a bathtub toy. While Wesley and others clung to their bunks and hid their heads, a community of Moravians who were traveling to their new homeland calmly gathered together to hold their daily worship service and to sing praises to God. Watching those Moravians, so apparently unperturbed by the howling winds and crashing waves, Wesley realized that he was witnessing a truly impermeable faith. From that moment on, John Wesley prayed that God would give him the ability to likewise ride out life's storms with that much confidence. And one Sunday evening back in England, God gave him an experience that represents the heart of Methodism even today. John himself wrote in his journal after that experience, "My heart was strangely warmed." He had opened his heart, and God responded. In the second letter to the church in Corinth, Paul writes in verse 11, "We have spoken frankly to you. Our heart is wide open to you." My friends, we can afford to have open hearts because God is there for all of us. We have already received the prize. The story is told of old Bishop Warren Chandler, after whom the School of Theology at Emory University was named. As he lay on his deathbed, a friend inquired as to whether or not he was afraid. "Please tell me frankly," the friend said, "do you fear crossing over the river of death?" "Why?" replied Chandler. "I belong to a Father who owns the land on both sides of the river." That is the ground of our hope and the promise of our deliverance from sin and death. In verse 12, Paul said, "There is no restriction on our affections." Christian love is an unconditional love. And yet, part of true love is holding one another accountable in love. I remember many, many years ago, my son is now 40, this was many years ago, I was talking to a friend about the latest encounter with his father, my son's father, in our dealings with our son. I was railing on about how thoughtless, unfair, inconsiderate, and wrong he was. My friend refused to sink with me into the depths of my frustration. Instead, he asked me, "What is the point of all this ranting? You aren't going to change him. Who are you damaging by the way you are responding in this situation?" He made me sit up and take stock of myself, to look in the mirror, and to see with fresh vision my own responsibility in that situation. And it's a lesson I have never forgotten. Paul said it this way, "There is no restriction in our affections, but only in yours." And finally, in today's reading, Paul ends with this, "In return, I speak as to children, open wide your hearts also." Open your hearts. Open hearts, that familiar logo for the United Methodist Church. Open hearts, open minds, open doors. Open doors. Yeah, sorry, that does kind of mislead, you're right. Open hearts, open minds, open doors. As United Methodists, we are always open to receive and to share and to love and to think. John the Baptist had an open heart, and so he shared the good news. But he also called the people to accountability for the way they represented the God that they claimed to follow. He called them to accountability because he loved them so deeply that he wanted them to be their very best. John Wesley had an open heart, and so he rode around the country on horseback, sharing the good news wherever he could with anyone who would listen. He taught them to gather together in class groups, to study God's word, to hold one another accountable to a life of holiness and sanctification. He taught them to love one another so deeply that they were willing to open their hearts to each other and to grow together in their lives and in their faith. And we too are called to open our hearts to let God in, to open our hearts to risk sharing ourselves with others, to open our hearts to see the injustice in the world and to do what we can to work to right it, to open our hearts so that all may see God, so that all may approach the altar of God with no roadblocks in their way, and particularly that we may never be a roadblock. Open hearts, open minds, open doors. May God bless us all.